Good evening and welcome to the third session of Seeking Truth and Justice in Israel, Palestine. This is a series of 4 conversations in person and live streamed from St. Chrysostom's Church here in Chicago. My name is Wes Smedley. Great joy and privilege to serve as rector of St. Chrysostom's Church. Please be aware tonight that this session is being recorded on video. We warmly encourage questions from the audience throughout the presentation. Those here in the church are invited to come use the microphone, which is a handheld microphone. You will not appear on camera. Those participating via Zoom and online can put their questions in the chat. And again, we're so glad that you're here and joining this important conversation. The purpose of these 4 conversations is to listen to the voices of Palestinians describing the reality of the situation in Israel and Palestine, to dig into the history of the situation in that part of the world and to how that brought us to where we are today, to focus on the role of the United States specifically, and to hear from Jewish voices calling for justice in Palestine. And finally, to consider what we can do to strive for justice and peace in the Holy Land. So I want to introduce and give thanks and gratitude for our speaker tonight, our guest, Rabbi Rosen. But before we do, I want to offer a prayer. And we are in a church, an Episcopal church, so I want to invite you to a moment of prayer using one of the prayers from the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this country, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatreds cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace. For your love's sake. Amen. And Rabbi Rosen, I have a special blessing for you as a peacemaker in our community, in the larger, wider community. This comes from a book of prayers and blessings called Speak It Plain. And this is specifically for our guest tonight. Persist, you maker of peace, in defiance of every invitation to use your power for something else. Showing up matters, and like the earth's tremble, can leave cracks in the facades that need to fall away in favor of peace stirred up for all. So I want to introduce Rabbi Brant Rosen. Rabbi Rosen is the rabbi of Tzedek, Chicago, a justice-focused synagogue, which he founded in 2015. Rabbi Rosen previously served for 16 years as rabbi of the Jewish Reconstructionist congregation in Evanston, Illinois, and he was the Midwest Regional Director of the American Friends Service Committee from 2014 to 2019. Rabbi Rosen is a former president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association and was the co-founder of the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council. Rabbi Rosen's writings have appeared in many journals and publications. He's also author of the blog Shalom Rav. His curated collection of blog posts and reader comments, Wrestling in the Daylight, A Rabbi's Path to Palestinian Solidarity, was published by Just World Books in 2012. Rabbi Rosen is also a prolific poet and liturgist. In 2018, Tzedek, Chicago, published his chapter book of prayers, Songs After the Revolution New Jewish Liturgy. He's currently working on a liturgical project at Harvard Divinity School, where he's a fellow in the Religion and Public Life program. Greetings, Rabbi Rosen. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And I have an important first question, a very serious first question to ask you as a fellow Chicagoan. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
All right. So Rabbi Rosen, as a fellow Chicagoan, would you say, even living in the North Side as you do, that you're more of a Cubs fan or more of a White Sox fan?
Well, I don't want to delve into any controversial territory tonight.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
Being from Los Angeles originally, I'll have to take the fifth on that one.
Okay. I was converted a few years ago by a wonderful member of our parish, Dorothy Ram, who's a longtime White Sox fan. So I have my White Sox merch on tonight. So Rabbi, thank you again for being here. I'm wanting to start our conversation tonight just to ask you to, if you're willing to set the context for our conversation, if you'd be willing to describe your current work as a rabbi of a congregation that specifically and publicly calls itself a non-Zionist Jewish congregation.
Of course. Thank you, Reverend Smedley, and thank you all. I'm very moved and touched by the introduction and by the prayer, and I'm very honored to be asked to speak to all of you this evening. I know that this is not a simple or straightforward subject. It's in fact a very painful one in many ways, and so I honor the fact that we're here to go to the heart of this often painful issue and really to create safe space for having this conversation. And I want to say at the outset that I have no doubt that those attending this program will, I have no illusions that everyone here will agree with everything I say. And really that's not the point of the program as I understand it this evening. It's really to have an honest and straightforward conversation about a deeply important political and moral issue that affects all of us as people of faith and as human beings of conscience. So thank you so much for the beautiful prayer and for being our host this evening. So I'll just say a little bit at the outset about my work. As the introduction stated, I am currently the rabbi of a congregation, Tzedek Chicago, that I helped found in 2015. Before coming to this work, my current work, I served a Reconstructionist congregation. I am a Reconstructionist rabbi. I belong to the Reconstructionist movement, which is where I was trained as a rabbi. For 16 years at Jewish Reconstructionist congregation in Evanston. And before that, I was 5 years at a Reconstructionist congregation in Denver. And for all of that time, and really for the majority of my adult life, I would say that I considered my work to be largely focused on healing in every sense of that word. And I understand that both in the individual sense and in the communal and even political sense. Working for social justice has always been a very central and important part of my rabbinate. And really important part of how I understand being Jewish. From the very earliest memories that I have, I was educated and instilled with the values that understood being a Jew to be devoted to pursuing justice and to healing the world, with the Jewish value of tikkun olam, of repairing the world, was a central, if not the most central, sacred Jewish value. I'm also, for most of my adult life, have been a Zionist, which means a supporter of the Jewish political nation state in the land. And I come by that quite honestly, actually. I have family on my father's side in Israel. I first visited Israel from a very young age, and I have been there many, many times, and really was raised to understand, to be a Jew meant to be living during this remarkable time, living this during this amazing sacred Jewish narrative post-Holocaust that viewed the world as understanding that following this horrible, tragic cataclysm of the tragedy and destruction of European Jewry and during the Shoah, that there was this amazing rebirth. There was this seemingly miraculous rebirth in historic Palestine, in the ancient homeland of the Jewish people. And that is a powerful narrative, there's no question. And I identified with Israel, as most, I think, American Jews do, as a very important part of my own Jewishness. As I said, I visited Israel many times. When I was in college, I took time off to live there. I lived there for 2 years, considered very seriously during that time of actually moving to Israel to live on kibbutz. I spent most of my time on 2 different kibbutzim. I decided not to do that and return to the United States to pursue to finish my undergraduate studies and then pursue rabbinical studies. But I always really understood the advocacy for the state of Israel as an important part of what it means to be Jewish. I would also say that in the spectrum of Zionists, I positioned myself on the left edge of Zionism. I was a liberal or progressive Zionist living on kibbutz. I identified very deeply with labor Zionism, which was embodied by the kibbutz movement. And I was very involved from an early age in advocating for peace between Palestinians and Jewish Israelis. I'm old enough to remember when advocating for a 2-state solution was considered a very edgy and risky thing to be saying out loud, which is kind of amazing to think about today. But I also harbored for many, many years, for much of that time, real qualms about the Zionist narrative. And I was never able to completely quell these voices that really challenged the core of that narrative. And we can talk more about that. But essentially, over the years during my tenure as a rabbi, I moved from what I would say as a progressive Zionist position to breaking with Zionism, to understanding that Zionism was not, as I had been raised to believe, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, so-called, but rather was a colonial movement that was established a Jewish state on the backs of another people. And that this rebirth, this seemingly miraculous rebirth, came about through the dispossession of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who were driven from their homes and not allowed to return, and eventually created the world's largest refugee population. And that Israel, as a result, was a heavily, heavily militarized nation. And as someone who was raised to be anti-war and to believe in seeking peace at all cost, somehow identifying with this nation that was so deeply militarized and using its military to occupy another people was a tension that I was never fully able to square. And so I eventually broke with Zionism when I was in my former congregation in Evanston. And the breaking point for me was 2008, the end of 2008. Which was Israel's military assault on Gaza, as I'm sure most of you remember, so-called Operation Cast Lead. And it was just a moment in which I realized that this so-called complicated conflict between two peoples was really not that complicated. And then, in fact, referring to it as a complicated conflict was a way of dodging the very real reality, as I understood it, that this was not a balanced conflict between two peoples who had a claim to the same piece of land, but rather a settler colonial enterprise that dispossessed and continued to oppress another people in order to create an ethnically Jewish nation state in a land that has always been historically multi-ethnic and multi-religious. And that the whole notion of creating a state that was both Jewish and democratic was really just a myth, that it was impossible to create a state on the backs of another people that was rooted in the identity of one particular group of people. It was impossible, I understood it now, to understand that such a state would not otherize people who were not Jewish. And in fact, maintaining military control over them was a recipe for further oppression and further military misery in the future. So I realized that for me, as a person of conscience, as a Jew, because I believe the core of my tradition, as I said before, is a sacred imperative to pursue justice, to pursue peace, to call out oppression, and to stand with the oppressed, that I realized that the most Jewish thing I could do was to stand with Palestinians. If I stood with oppressed people as a Jewish person, that meant standing with Palestinians, as well as painful as that might be. And so I was able to do that for a number of years in JRC, my former congregation. And to their credit, the leadership of the congregation really respected my need to speak my conscience as a rabbi, but at the same time, we worked very hard to facilitate a wide tent kind of congregation in which those who were supporters of Israel or Zionists and those who were not, and there was a small number of people who shared my conscience on this issue, could coexist. We worked very, very hard to create a system in which we could create that safe space for all. And I made a point of, whenever I was advocating in public, to make sure to say that I was speaking for myself as an individual and not my congregation. And I was able to do that for a number of years until it just became untenable. And we can talk more about that, about the difficulties with this kind of attention in creating a wide or open tent congregation on this issue. But I eventually had to leave the congregation in 2014. I left voluntarily, and not coincidentally, that was during another military assault on Gaza, which I'm sure most of you remember, occurred in the late fall of 2014. Another onslaught in which thousands of Gazans were killed. A small strip of land that contained 2 million people who had literally nowhere to run were being bombed incessantly. Thousands of people killed, 600, hundreds of children killed, whole families killed. It was just impossible for me to see this as a war of defense, and it was impossible for me not to speak out. And so it caused great pain in certain quarters of my congregation, and created a kind of a tension that made my ability to be the rabbi of that congregation impossible. So I left the congregation and worked for the American Friends Service Committee for the next 5 years out of the Chicago office as the director of the Midwest region, as my introduction mentioned. But I also, shortly after that, started with a number of friends and colleagues and former congregants, started a small gathering, Jewish gathering, just so that we could have a Jewish spiritual address for ourselves, because we were without a congregation. And that eventually became the nucleus of what was the congregation that we founded in the summer of 2015, which we called Tzedek Chicago. And Tzedek is the Hebrew word for justice. And when we founded that congregation, when I was approached actually by certain members of the congregation to do it, we sat down before we recruited a single member and decided what we wanted to do. First was to be very clear about what we stood for. So we drafted a set of core values, and we made it very clear that the values of Tzedek Chicago would be values of anti-militarism, of nonviolence, of anti-racism, of standing with the oppressed and calling out the oppressor. And we made a point of mentioning that we were not a Zionist congregation. As we put it in our values, we do not celebrate the fusing of Jewish spiritual tradition with political nationalism, and that we believe that that fusing has resulted in the dispossession of another people and an oppression of that people, and dispossession that continues to this day. It wasn't a one-time thing in 1948. This dispossession continues through home demolition, through revoking of residents' rights, and through a number of forms of demographic engineering to maintain a Jewish majority in the land, to deal with what is the so-called demographic threat that the government of Israel speaks of so often. So we made it very, very clear that this was the foundation of our congregation. And we had no idea how many people would join us, but we knew that we wanted to create this kind of a synagogue of conscience. Our approach was, if this is your vision of Judaism, please join us. If you dig what we're doing, we would love to have you as members. And if you don't, that's fine too. There are lots of synagogues out there to choose from. And from our very first high holiday service in the fall of 2015, we had over 200 people attend. And our congregation grew steadily over that time. I was doing it as a part-time side project while I worked full-time at AFSC, but the congregation grew to the point where I was unable to do both at the same time. And so at the beginning of 2020, I became Tzedek Chicago's full-time rabbi. I left American Friends to return to full-time congregational rabbiing, which was something I genuinely did not think I would ever be able to do when I left my former congregation. So it's been, that's been my own journey. And I do believe that the growth of Tzedek Chicago and the subsequent growth of other spiritual Jewish communities that are very similar to us, there is now a network that is facilitated by the Jewish Voice for Peace of congregations and chavarot, which are small Jewish fellowship groups that share the kinds of values that I just described. We have about 60 or so of these communities. And I do believe that there is a growing desire for a Judaism beyond Zionism, I would say, that Judaism and Zionism are not the same thing. Zionism is a political movement that was founded in the 19th century, that was part of a larger European nationalist enterprise at the time that sought to create a Jewish nation state in historic Palestine. It was a controversial movement from the beginning. There were Jewish anti-Zionists from the very beginning. And after the establishment of the state, after the Holocaust and the establishment of the state, Zionism grew in its centrality to Jewish life, but there have always been dissidents in the Jewish community when it comes to Zionism. And we feel that it's important to be able to, with integrity, point out the difference, to be able to pursue a Zionism that is not rooted in militarist nation statehood, and that there's nothing un-Jewish or anti-Semitic about that. In fact, it is part of deeply held spiritual values that have been part of Jewish tradition for centuries. And every demographic study of the Jewish community shows that increasing numbers of Jews share this idea. And in fact, many of them tend to be in the 30 and under range, that the younger generations of Jews are just not sharing that narrative that I described at the beginning, that are seeking a different kind of narrative, a narrative that sees sanctity and solidarity with all peoples who are oppressed and don't want to put militarization and nation statehood and occupation at the center of their Judaism. So I'll stop there. I know I've covered quite a bit of territory, and
you've given us a lot of, may I just ask, you use the word colonialist and colonial in relation to Zionism, in distinguish or contradistinction to Judaism. Would you be willing to speak a bit more about what you mean when you say a colonial enterprise?
Sure. I mean, I agree with those who believe that Israel is a settler colonial state. By the way, the United States is a settler colonial state. In other words, a state that was created as a European movement that was bringing in a population of people to create colonies to settle that state in order to create a new identity, to bring people of the same group to create a nation state predicated on the identity of that group. And settler colonialism often results in the dispossession of the indigenous people of that land. In the case of the United States, it involved both the extermination and the creation of reservations, not to mention the creation of a slave trade in order to build that nation. That is the way settler colonialism in this country was created. And in the state of Israel, the nation state of Israel, it occurred through, as I said before, the dispossession of Palestinians from their homes, not allowing them to return, creating refugees, creating a minority population within the new state of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, but still creating a state predicated on the identity of this one people. Zionism, the state of Israel was always, even prior to its establishment, was created through colonial means. European Jews went there to settle colonies, quite literally. And they did so with the support of major colonial powers. The Balfour Declaration and Britain being the most primary example of that. In other words, seeking the support of colonial powers in order to create this new settler state. So, you know, as I said before, I was raised to see Israel as the quote unquote national liberation movement of the Jewish people, but it wasn't until I became more educated in the history of colonialism that I came to understand that national liberation movements are movements of native peoples who struggle against colonial oppression. And that was a inappropriate use, to put it mildly, of that term to describe Zionism. There's no question that it represents liberation for Jews following the Holocaust, and that Israel represents liberation and safety and security following this horrible, tragic cataclysm. But the truth is that, as I said before, it occurred at the expense of another people. And I don't believe, and I don't believe Judaism holds, that you can fully achieve liberation through the dispossession of another people, that's not true liberation. And also, it hasn't really arrived at safety and security because Israel has needed to hold its territory through military means and became one of the most militarized countries in the world, quite literally, in order to hold on to that sense of security. And ironically enough, the one place that was intended to be safe space for Jews ended up being the one place where Jews feel targeted the most in the geopolitical sense. Although that has changed over the years as Israel has become ensconced in the Western hegemony in the Middle East. So we can talk more about that, but I do believe that the state of Israel fits in a very real way the definition of what a settler colonial nation is.
The other question right off the bat that I wanted to invite more of your thoughts on is your use of the word anti-Semitism. And if you'd just be willing to share from your perspective that you've just given us the context for what is anti-Semitism and what is not anti-Semitism. It feels like there are different narratives out there that can confuse those of us like me.
You know, it should be fairly straightforward. You know, anti-Semitism, I would define as the hatred of Jews for being Jews, or the demonization of Judaism itself as a religion. And often those go hand in hand, but they're not necessarily always both present at the same time. Anti-Semitism has its roots in Christianity, in the Christian church, that demonized the Jews through a supersessionist ideology that posited that there was a quote unquote new Israel, that God had superseded quite literally the Jewish people, and that the Jews were stubbornly holding on to this old paradigm, and as a result were demonized according to Christian dogma. And anti-Semitism in its origins was a religious movement. It has many, many different tropes, some of them quite complex and sometimes even contradictory, but I'm sure many are familiar with these tropes, that the Jews are a conspiratorial people, that they're a fifth column in the nations in which they live. They seek world domination. They are seeking to control the world's monetary wealth and resources. So there's this notion of them being part of this capitalist conspiracy, but then also there are tropes that demonize Jews for being communist and part of the Bolshevik conspiracy. So it's not necessarily a consistent ideology.
No.
I would also say that in the 20th century, this religious hatred took on racial significance, which found its nadir in Nazi ideology, which itself found its nadir in the horrors of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. So what began as a form of religious hatred ended up being something that was deeply racialized. Before that, Jews could presumably, in many instances, and Jews who lived in Christendom, avoid persecution by converting to Christianity. I mean, the best example of that, of course, is the Spanish Inquisition and the conquest of Spain from the Islamic Empire to Catholicism, that Jews could save themselves, save their lives through forced conversion. Under racialism, those options were not available. Jews were seen, according to these tropes, as incorrigibly demonic, or seen as vermin and parasitic. And the only way to save society was to eradicate them from society. So, white supremacist anti-Semitism, which, as I said before, came to fruition through Nazi Germany, is still very, very much with us. The murderer who gunned down Jewish worshipers in Pittsburgh 3 years ago, and it was almost exactly 3 years ago now, was a white supremacist who believed in many of these tropes that I just described. And that kind of anti-Semitism has never gone away. It's been subterranean, perhaps. I would argue that with this resurgence of and a re-emboldening of white supremacist movements, particularly under the Trump years, they've become unleashed in many ways. And I think we're going to continue to see this kind of white supremacist hatred that does not only target Jews, by the way. The murderer at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was believed that the Jewish people were undermining the United States by bringing immigrants to this country, primarily Muslim immigrants, but also immigrants from Latin America. That was his reasoning. So in his letter, in his manifesto, he said first the Jews and then the Muslims. I believe that the true response to anti-Semitism is solidarity, is those who are targeted by this kind of intolerance need to stand together. And even those who are not targeted need to stand with those who are. That solidarity is the deepest and most profound source of security that we can find in the most appropriate response to this hatred. One of the things, unfortunately, that we're seeing now is a new right-wing agenda that seeks to combat Islam, what they consider to be the dangers of Islam, the Islamification, so-called, of Western society, and also those who seek to demonize Palestinians, quite frankly, by claiming that that this is the most dangerous form of anti-Semitism in the world at the moment, and that's simply, I fervently believe, is a cynical, politically driven agenda. Now, that's not to say that there aren't Muslim anti-Semites, and it's not to say that there are Palestinian anti-Semites, but to point to some kind of movement that of anti-Semitism that is somehow on par with the ideology, the deeply rooted ideology of white supremacist and right-wing anti-Semitism, is just, I think, a cynical political ploy, and it's resulted in this canard that being anti-Zionist is somehow consonant with anti-Semitism. As I said before, Zionism is not Judaism. There have been many venerable Jewish anti-Zionists before the establishment of the state, during and after. I consider myself one of them in all humility. So it is a canard, and it's a deeply harmful one, because it does real harm to the Jewish community, to the integrity of the Jewish community, by doing that. The last thing I want to say is that Israel, the government of Israel itself, is in many cases fomenting anti-Semitism, politically making common cause with anti-Semitic regimes, such as the one in Hungary. Israel, in a certain way, needs anti-Semitism in a kind of perverse kind of way to justify its existence. The whole raison d'etre of Zionism is that the world is an incorrigibly anti-Semitic place, and the only solution to that is for Jews to live in a state of their own. And that's resulted, I think, in many ways, in many disturbing ways. And this even predates the establishment of the State of Israel, of members of the leaders in the Zionist movement currying favor with anti-Semites for political gain, for political purposes.
I'm just reading a question, and it's relating to what you're talking about right now, about how criticism of the state of Israel has become synonymous with anti-Semitism. So this question from one of our listeners and participants is, I have Jewish friends who see the need for justice for the Palestinian people, but who also see the BDS movement as uniquely anti-Semitic. Would you be willing to share your perspective on the BDS movement?
Sure. The BDS movement is a movement that was a civil society call from Palestinians in 2004. Over 150 civil society organizations in Palestine who realized that the chances for a viable Palestinian state were ebbing away, that there were governments throughout the world were not holding Israel to account, and that there needed to be some kind of leverage to force Israel to cease from its occupation and oppression of the Palestinian people. So they came together to form this Palestinian civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, with three basic goals. And that is an end to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and honoring of the Palestinian right of return of Palestinian refugees. Those are the three basic goals of the BDS movement. And I for those who aren't familiar with it, And here of this demonization, I want to make that really very, very clear. The goals of the BDS movement are rooted in international law and human rights and equality for all. There is nothing about the BDS movement that calls for the destruction of Jews. There is nothing that in the BDS movement that seeks the destruction of the state of Israel. It's calling for equal rights for all people who live between the river and the sea. And it's using a time-honored, nonviolent tactic, namely boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So to call it anti-Semitic when it's really rooted in a vision of international law and human rights, using a tactic that is inherently nonviolent, that we venerate when it comes to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and the divestment and boycott of apartheid South Africa, or the civil rights movement in this country, the Montgomery bus boycott being one classic example of that, the United Farm Workers boycott. These are time-honored, venerable, nonviolent tactics in which there is a popular call to form a movement to hold power to account. One of the canards I hear that refer to BDS as anti-Semitic is they compare it to the Nazi Germany boycott of Jews in the 1940s. And that is, it's just simply patently ridiculous on its face. In that case, this was a government that was enacting a boycott to oppress its own citizens. And what we have with the Palestinian civil society is a popular call that is seeking a boycott of an extremely powerful militarized nation state to observe and respect rules of international law. So there's no comparison between the two. You also hear people say, well, why should we be singling out Israel among all the horrible human rights abusers in the world? This is a double standard. What about these other countries? And again, I would say that that's a form of misdirection, quite frankly, because the point of a BDS call is that it's a call. It's a call that is coming from the Palestinian people themselves. And so the question before us is, do we think that it is a call that is worthy of our response or not? The question is not, what about these other countries? If there are oppressed peoples in other countries that have come together to organize for a civil society call to support their cause, that is something we should consider. But that doesn't ipso facto negate the importance of the Palestinian call. So really, the important question is, do we think it's a call worth responding to? And I believe, and I think increasing numbers of not only people of conscience, but members of the Jewish community believe that as well.
Thank you. We have another question. I wanted to touch base on something before we get to the next question. You've mentioned Jewish Voice for Peace. And I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to give a quick description of how that came about and what's going on with Jewish Voice for Peace now.
Sure. Jewish Voice for Peace is a Jewish organization that is really a national organization. It began as a network of local Jewish initiatives throughout the country, and they ended up merging together to form Jewish Voice for Peace. And these initiatives were essentially chapters throughout chapters throughout the country of Jews and allies of Jews who expressed their Jewish conscience through standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And we do that through a number of ways, including both respecting and initiating BDS campaigns ourselves, standing with Christian denominations that are considering divestment resolutions on their GAs on a national level. But we also, it's very much a grassroots kind of movement. In other words, it's rooted in the chapters on the ground, and it's a membership organization, as opposed to other Jewish organizations or other religious organizations that are run as nonprofits with boards. This is a membership organization that's run by the members themselves. Very recently, there was a 501c4 of Jewish Voice for Peace called JVP Action that is involved in political advocacy in Washington, D.C. So that aspect of activism has been added to the mix now, which is basically supporting candidates who support human rights for Palestinians. And there's been some amazing success. We have our first Palestinian American openly supportive of the Palestinian cause, Palestinian American congressperson from Michigan now, and a number of others who run on a platform that includes human rights for Palestinians. And JVP Action seeks to support and to enlarge their cadre in Washington.
Thank you. We have a question from our live in-person congregation here.
Am I being heard?
Go
Yes.
ahead, Priscilla.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question here from one of our listeners. Can you comment on Israeli military forces training U.S. police forces, including in Chicago, in anti-terrorist tactics?
Yes.
Which the Chicago police have at times applied to progressive political activists in this country, including Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Movement.
That's actually one campaign that was initiated by Jewish Voice for Peace, which is known as Deadly Exchange. And you can find out more about Deadly Exchange online. But it's basically responding to this reality that the Israeli military, which has been involved in training dubious military institutions throughout history, including apartheid South Africa and other regimes in Latin America and otherwise, has been for many years now involved in the training of US police forces who literally go to Israel to learn their tactics, both their tactics in quote unquote riot control, but also surveillance and other techniques that have been perfected through this laboratory that in the West Bank and Gaza. And I will say that one of the ways that the movement for justice in Palestine has grown is that we're able to make these connections, that this is not unique to the state of Israel. The state violence and militarism that is perpetuated by police forces in this country against people of color is really inseparable from the state violence that Israel perpetrates or other militaries perpetrate against minorities, oppressed minorities around the country. And so we believe it's very important to shine a light on these alliances, which are enormously destructive and have had very real impact on people of color, and as during Black Lives Matter protests, but also just people of color who have been singled out by police forces around the country for many, many years. I just want to add this one anecdote. I participated in an action on the border in the San Diego Tijuana border when I was with American Friends. It was an interfaith mobilization protesting the militarization of the border. This was during the Trump administration, but that militarization continues to this day. And we were tear gassed by the border police there, who were just heavily armed, wearing complete riot gear. They reminded me of similar actions that I participated in the West Bank, by the way, almost identical. And in fact, when I saw the tear gas canisters, they were exactly the same tear gas canisters that I saw used against Palestinians in Israel, silver canisters with light blue lettering that are made in Statesville, Pennsylvania, which at that moment, when I saw those canisters on the ground during that action, and I realized that the same ones that were being used against immigrant justice activists in this country were the ones who were used against an immigrant and immigrants themselves, and Palestinian, those who stood in solidarity with them in the West Bank. To me, that was one of the most dramatic examples of how this intersection of oppression is really quite global and needs to be seen that way.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, what chance is there that the Biden administration will threaten to withhold US dollars to hold the state of Israel to account for those values?
Oh, I can only give my personal opinion on this, and I think the chances are slim to none. I do think that there are increasing numbers of Congresspeople who are have the courage of their convictions and are speaking out. There were 9 of them who spoke out very, very courageously recently when there was debate going on about the so-called Iron Dome defense system, and Israel's asking for an additional $1 billion on top of the $4 billion that was already being given. And there were 9 Congresspeople who said, we're not giving them any more money. We need to condition aid. It's still a distinct minority. So I don't think that the focus on the Biden administration in many ways is the wrong focus. I think we need to be holding our representatives, those who represent us, to account, to let them know if we believe that we don't want our money going toward the oppression of the Palestinian people and the abuse of human rights, to let them know that and to vote accordingly when it's voting season.
So I have a question just from our conversation earlier today and tonight. You are a rabbi, you're a person of faith and a community faith leader. I'm just curious, some of the feedback I've gotten just from Christian colleagues as well as some Jewish colleagues are that we shouldn't be having this conversation here tonight. I'm just curious, how do you wrap your head around that as a Jewish person of faith? How do you understand that sense of threat simply by this very conversation here tonight? And would you be willing to share personally from your faith as a rabbi how you understand tension that is involved with this very conversation, I guess?
Yeah. You know, I think this is absolutely the conversation we need to be having tonight. I think pursuing justice often means going to the heart of tension, right? It means not glossing over tension. And I think that's a spiritual tradition that's unique to all religious traditions worth their salt. You know, I often quote in this regard Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he was addressing this very issue, because he went to Birmingham to go to the heart of this, to create tension. And there were liberal clergy people, Christians and Jews in Birmingham, who were saying, you're an outside agitator, stay away. We've got this under control. We're trying to engage with the white supremacists here, and you're just going to cause trouble. And King very, very powerfully talked about the spiritual imperative to create tension, and that all historically no important liberation or societal transformation has occurred without the fomenting of tension. You know, power concedes nothing without a demand, as it never has and it never will, as Frederick Douglass said. And King said something very similar when he said that we know from history that power is never given up voluntarily by the powerful. It must be demanded by the oppressed. So, you know, I would say to those who are dismayed by the tension that's caused from these kinds of conversations, I would say that is some of the most sacred and deeply important spiritual imperatives we have and have always had. No, I understand Christians' reticence to do this. And I think in this regard, I would invoke the narrative that I talked about before. the narrative of the Holocaust, the horrors of the Holocaust, and the rebirth, the seeming rebirth of the Jewish nation embodied by the state of Israel. And that is a very powerful narrative. And for Christians who are reckoning with Christian complicity in the Holocaust, and that is very real, I think there is a tendency to stay quiet on the issue of Israel, or at the very least, or support Israel as some way of some form of payback for Christian involvement and Christian responsibility during World War II. And there have been many who have written about this. Mark Ellis, who is a very important Jewish theologian, refers to this as the ecumenical deal, which is, and it goes both ways, by the way. The Jewish community is well, I shouldn't call them the Jewish community. Certain leaders in the institutional Jewish establishment have become very, very expert at this deal, at saying basically your price for dialogue with the Jewish community is support for Israel, or at the very least staying quiet on these issues. And I would argue that as a Jew and as a person of conscience, that Christians are doing the Jewish people, and certainly the Palestinians, and really nobody, any favors by staying quiet in the face of oppression. And I understand that it's very, very difficult given the narrative that I just described. And I also know that it's very difficult because there are churches who have lovely relationships with the synagogue down the street, and this could mean jeopardizing that relationship. And I get that. But I would say two things to that. One is that I think true interfaith cooperation should not only be about talking about all the wonderful things we have in common and flattening out the playing field to just celebrate all, our respective traditions in the most general way possible. But true interfaith collaboration means going to the heart of these very difficult issues and going to the heart of that tension. And if we're not willing to do that, I don't know how we can call ourselves people of faith. That's one thing. And yeah, the other thing is just that it ultimately, if the price of that relationship with the synagogue down the street is staying silent on the issue of oppression, that's not a relationship that's worthy of cultivating, in my opinion. And as heartbreaking as that might be, because I know there are synagogues and churches that have long-standing relationships, but if it's based on looking the other way, I think sooner or later there needs to be a reckoning on that.
Thank you. There's some other questions coming in. As they do come in, I wanted to ask a question of language. You've mentioned the language of apartheid, and I've heard ethnic cleansing and other phrases. I'm just wondering, would you be willing to speak about how can we talk honestly and candidly about the situation in Israel, Palestine? Is apartheid an appropriate use? And if not, what is the right language for what's happening?
This past year, the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem came out with a report, which I highly recommend to folks if you haven't read it, which labeled Israel, and when I say Israel, from the river to the sea, in other words, not just the occupied territories, but Israel proper, as one apartheid state. The name of the report is a regime of Jewish supremacy from the river to the sea. So they use the term apartheid and the term Jewish supremacy. And that is, in other words, an ideology that is rooted in the primacy of one specific group of people over another. And it also refers politically to laws that are enacted to benefit one people over another. And that report, and the B'Tselem is to my mind, a venerable Israeli human rights organization. And I'm glad to see that it's the link to the report is being posted now in the chat for those who are on Zoom. If B'Tselem is willing to call Israel an apartheid regime, then we need to find the courage of our conscience to do the same. And I know some of these words are very uncomfortable words to use. I actually think, I used to feel differently about this. I used to try to avoid words that I felt were too incendiary, that could inhibit people from really hearing the message. And so I try to find other words to describe the same thing. So, dispossession, or, oppression or persecution. But, I've come around to realizing that these words need to be said out loud. Israel needs to be stigmatized. Israel is not going to reform itself all by itself. It can only be transformed to a nation that observes international law and human rights through outside pressure. And I think the use of these words, which are increasingly now, ethnic cleansing being another one. Also, Human Rights Watch also came out with a similar report on the issue of apartheid, and Human Rights Watch has used the word war crimes and even crimes against humanity to describe Israel's behavior during Gaza assaults. We need to say these things out loud, because this is one tool in the toolkit to leverage pressure, international pressure, to bring Israel to account. And it's always been that case. It was the case in South Africa. In the case of South Africa, South Africans, they coined the term apartheid and proudly used it, but it's been stigmatized ever since. But the basic notion of the international community coming together to hold a country to account, I think, is still holds.
Thank you. One of my colleagues here in person has a question. You go ahead and read that if you don't mind, John, with the microphone.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can you comment on Israel's action last week in declaring 6 major Palestinian human rights organizations as being terrorist organizations? What do those organizations actually do? And what are the consequences of declaring them to be terrorist organizations?
Well, these organizations are very important organizations, and I've personally, in my own activism, partnered with many of them, almost all of them, for many years. Organization like Adallah, which is an organization that seeks full civil rights for Arab citizens of Israel. And if you go to their website, you'll see a long list of laws that structurally discriminate against Arab citizens of Israel according to Israeli law, rendering them as second-class citizens. Defense for Children International Palestine, DCI Palestine, which is an enormously important human rights organization that in particular is doing important work on the rights of children who are abducted and held in military detention and tried in military courts, often for weeks at a time without their parents knowing where they are, where there's an over 99% conviction rate. So if, standing up for the human rights of children who are being subjected to military oppression, and by the way, Israel is the only country in the world that subjects children to military detention and imprisonment. If standing up for the human rights of children makes you a terrorist, I think that in and of itself should be Exhibit A in what we're dealing with here. Calling them terrorists will have very real impact on these organizations. They could potentially decimate these organizations in terms of their funding, in terms of the ability of their staff people to access places where they need to go in order to do their work. So this is very real, and this is the thing, when you hear people going back to the issue of BDS, raising a hue and cry against a popular movement that is holding this government of this militarized nation to account, and they are vilified continually and are constantly on the front pages. I mean, we were learning about Ben and Jerry's for weeks. We were reading about it in the New York Times. We were reading about ice cream in the West Bank when Ben and Jerry's pulled out, you know, of selling their product in the West Bank. Have you seen anything in the mainstream press is nearly as prominent when it comes to labeling these human rights organizations as terrorists, when in fact the consequences of this will be much, much more dire and much more real and deeply harmful? So this, you know, for all of those in the Jewish establishment that talk about this double standard, this is, to my mind, the true double standard, that the real terrorism, and I don't like using that is one buzzword I don't like using because it's been so thoroughly politicized. But if I could use it just this once, if we're talking about the real terrorists, I would call it the Israeli military, quite frankly. And the Israeli government that is behind this military. So I think this is very, very serious. It deserves much more attention. There are letters that are being written, and if there's anybody out there who has a link to some of the petitions that are out there to the State Department to protest in no uncertain terms this act, I strongly recommend folks to sign on.
Mindful that we're coming into the later part of the evening and we have a few more minutes, but I just received another question. I'm hoping that there's time for this. Would that be okay?
Of course.
Okay. Oh, good. Okay. Can you comment, or would you be willing to comment on the implications for the entire Middle East of unqualified United States support of Israel? Just a small question.
No, without going into the deep geopolitical minutia of a question like that, I think anything that contributes to the greater militarization of that region of the world will only end up in tragedy. And of course, we're not only talking about Israel-Palestine, right? I mean, the United States military support, either direct or indirect, has created instability in that region for decades. So my basic answer to that is, if anyone wants to see a true peace, a peace rooted in genuine security, it means doing everything we can to demilitarize that part of the world. And you know, I think underlying everything I've been saying this evening is a vision, and again, a spiritual vision that is rooted in demilitarization, that nation shall not lift up sword against nation. You know, if those are just going to be cliches, then we shouldn't bother going to church or synagogue anymore. You know, but if we really believe in the biblical imperative to pursue peace and to destroy our weapons of death at all costs, and that's not to say that there aren't, you know, legacies in the Bible that are heavily militaristic. I am very well aware of that. But what that does is, what I would argue is that creates a very moral question that lays before us. And that is, which legacy are we going to lift up and which legacy are we going to stand down in no uncertain terms? We can't have it both ways, and we can't pick and choose the ones that are expedient for it, this political issue and that political issue. If we are going to lift up the anti-militarist and the anti-war ethic that runs so deep, particularly in the prophetic tradition of the Bible, then we need to be consistent, because it's not an academic question. It's very real, and we know that. It's immiserated not only that part of the world, but many other parts of the world as well. And I'm unabashedly and unreservedly a religious anti-militarist.
I was corrected. We have a few more minutes. And so I'm wondering, we have a question over here. Priscilla, would you be willing to ask?
Actually, we have a lot of questions taking place on the chat.
And there are two fairly broad ones. I'll start with the first two have appeared. This is from someone, Brant, who has read any number of your blog posts. She asks, if a two-state solution is morally corrupt or practically impossible, What can you offer as an equitable and feasible alternative?
So forgive me if this feels like a dodge, but I'm loath to answer questions like that because I feel that we put the cart before the horse when we focus on the political endgame. As long as there is very real oppression and apartheid and ethnic cleansing on the ground currently, the first order of business is to end the oppression. And I think often this undue focus on the political parameters of the the final state that's going to be imposed there, as long as we focus on one state or two state or this state or that state or federation or republic or what have you, that gives us an out to speaking out against the very real oppression that's going on right now as we speak. So all I will say in answer to that question is, I think there are many different ideas, interesting ideas that are being put forth for what the eventual nation state will look like and some form of power sharing. I will also say that it's not for me to dictate that because I don't live there. And I think that will be up to the people who live there to work that out among themselves. But in the meantime, we shouldn't be focusing on the future at the expense of the present. The first thing we need to do is to stop the abuse that's happening on our watch. And when the abuser is being held to account, then we can talk about things like statehood. Actually, even before that, we need to be talking about things like reparations and restorative justice and some kind of process of reparation. So, I would just argue that we need to, it's fine to surmise about what the eventual political settlement will look like, but I think the primary focus needs to be on stopping the abuse first and foremost.
Another participant is raising questions related to whether in Christian communities and in Muslim communities, there are efforts akin to what you have done in SEDEC to separate from Christian and Islamist nationalism. I'm wondering if this person may be thinking in terms of efforts made by any number of churches to date to separate themselves from the doctrine of discovery, as an example.
Yes, I'm aware of many progressive Christian churches and communities who that I've learned a great deal from in terms of pursuing a decolonial ethic and understanding that in religious terms. And and in as much as the colonial movement is something that was deeply rooted in Christian history, I think there's a very unique kind of reckoning that's going on in those communities. So I have many colleagues, clergy colleagues and lay colleagues who are involved in communities like that. I know of many, not necessarily masjids, Muslim mosques, which really are first and foremost places of prayer and internal welfare for the Muslim community, but Muslim organizations that are speaking out. I have many dear friends, actually, Imam Malik Mujahid, who I've learned a great deal from, who lives here in Chicago, and runs a Muslim communications organization that takes on these kinds of issues that we've been talking about nationalism and militarism in a very direct way as well. So, on an interfaith level, these kinds of things are happening. And, I think we need, those of us who are trying to be involved in organizing a movement around this need to be creating those relationships and cultivating them very actively.
Thank you. Other questions, John or Priscilla?
Yeah, this is a longer question. I can read it. One participant says, that many evangelical Christians see the return of Jewish people to the Holy Land as an initiation of the end times. What would you say to an evangelical Christian who sees only a religious component of Israel's modern establishment in view of the return of that nature?
Well, the first thing I would say is my issue with that religious vision is not only that it's exclusively religious, but that it ends up in annihilation of all those who don't believe like they do, which is not a recipe for peace in that part of the world. It's also deeply anti-Semitic in as much as those Jews who are important to that ideology because we are the ones who need to return to that land to facilitate this this millennial endgame, a millenarian endgame rather, that we are basically pawns in their own theological drama, and those of us who don't accept the second coming will be annihilated along with the rest of the unbelievers. That is just, another version of a time-honored anti-Semitic Christian ideology that we're all too familiar with. So I understand that there are political expediencies that the state of Israel and advocates of Israel are cultivating with Christian Zionists, but I think it's rooted in political expediency and not in any shared religious ideology. I think it's very cynical. I think it's important to know that Christian Zionists have been around for a very, very long time, even before Jewish Zionists, by the way. And they are by far the largest financial and political supporters of the state of Israel in this country. When we talk about the so-called Israel lobby, that we need to be really, really clear that that this is a very real danger. This is, it's a clear and present danger. And during the Trump years, it was quite frightening because we had someone very close to the presidency, Mike Pence, who himself was a Christian Zionist and who fervently believes these kinds of things. And we had a president who unabashedly was currying favor with Christian Zionists for his own support, for his own political support. And we have governments of Israel who understand how anti-Semitic this ideology is, but look the other way because it means accepting their financial and political and diplomatic support. So again, it's nothing rooted in anything that I would call religious integrity. It's about political expediency, and I think we need to see it that way and call it that.
Thank you. John, Priscilla, any others, or can we call it a night? I'm mindful of Rabbi Rosen's time too, and all our participants.
Yes, I just noticed on the chat Mike Pompeo as well. That's absolutely right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I should also mention that, just because we're out of the Trump years doesn't mean that danger has abated. They're an enormously politically powerful sector of this country.
Rabbi Rosen, thank you for being here tonight, for being present, for your work, and for sharing yourself, your wisdom, your thoughts, your experiences with this group here in person and online. And just thank you.
Well, thank you, Reverend Smedley. And thank you all who are here. I appreciate and don't underestimate what it means to invite someone like me to speak to you. But I want to honor what we were talking about before about the importance of having these difficult conversations. I want to reiterate also, I know that there will be people either in the room now or those who are watching this recording who take exception to things that I said, and this is as it should be. These are the hard conversations we need to be having, and in the hopes that it'll lead to something that is very just and lasting, not only in that part of the world, but for all of us.
Good night. We hope to hear more from you soon.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Thank you so much for participating tonight.